Welcome back to Microeconomics. I'm Keith Yakucha. In this video, we're going to cover the idea of institutions, fairness, and the rules of the game. The basic outcome is we're going to take a look at a series of about 6 examples of hey, what's the difference between having the ability to have ownership of your land, that is property rights, and choosing freely how much to utilize your land for your own benefit, versus other various outcomes, such as forced slave labor, being forced into a take it or leave it contract, some tenancy arrangements, or being able to use the legal framework or the democratic framework to change the rules in your favor one way or another. We will finish with the negotiated outcome, and that is how we can engage in negotiations to obtain hopefully, a better, improved outcome for everyone. This topic really just pulls forward concepts from our production possibility frontier, that is our feasibility set. It pulls forward concepts from our indifference curves. So again, that is our rates of indifference such that we maintain the same level of happiness. And we'll be utilizing these concepts to work through for various different rules of the game, what are the maximizing levels of output that we can get. So often we take it for granted. So much of economics is how do we maximize given the rules of the game? But one of the most important things to realize is that the rules of the game can always be changed. That is the funny thing with the game that we're playing of the greater economy. And so if we take a look at various rules of the game, we can take a look at the various social outcomes and, of course, those distributional outcomes to the different parties that are akin to this game. So I'm talking a lot about this. Let's go jump over and take a look at what exactly we're talking about, as well as go through some of the basic assumptions we need in order to actually evaluate this. So let's go jump over and have a look. Okay, so altogether up here on the right-hand side, we have these 6 different types of rules of the game that we are going to look at and evaluate in this scenario. On the left-hand side, what we have is we have the feasibility set, our production possibility frontier, and that is going to be how many this is short for bushels of wheat, bushels of agricultural good, that we're able to produce. We have our farmer, and in this case here, we will presume that our farmer, let's use the right color for her. We will presume that the farmer, this is just taking the textbook example, we'll presume that our farmer is Angela. And then on the other side, we have potentially, at least in 2 through 6, we have the landlord or the owner of the land, which we take as being Bruno. Again, just taking the textbook example from the Unit 5 of the core textbook. So we have our feasibility set in white, and we have the indifference curve in blue. And what we start off with is this basic assumption, and this is just a simplifying assumption for us, which is that Angela, the one who has this indifference curve here, that her indifference curves, her utility curves are only increasing in bushels. So that is, she's not getting higher utility necessarily for more free time. Her utility only increases with bushels. The result of this is just if we were to take her indifference curve, it only moves vertically. So just increases with the amount of bushels of agricultural product she ends up getting. Why is this of interest to us? This is of interest to us because for some point here, if we were to go and figure out what is her marginal rate of substitution, let's use the right tool for that. There we go. So if we were to figure out what's her marginal rate of substitution for 16 hours, we get some point roughly like that would be the, again, marginal rate of substitution is just the slope of that. That's not quite perfect. Let's see if we can just do a bit better, rotate that a little bit. There we go. Maybe that guy's a bit better. What we see is that if her indifference curves are just increasing in the one good, that is bushels, well, then her marginal rate of substitution stays the same for a fixed free time. So there is this constant marginal rate of substitution just as we increase the number of bushels. Mind you, if we had the opposite assumption, and that is the opposite assumption is that her utility only increases in terms of free time, well, then the same would be true for a fixed amount of bushels. If Angela gets increases in utility for both increases in free time and increases in bushels, then her utility moves up to the right at some rate between the two, and the point where her marginal rate of substitution stays the same would be some line going up to the right correspondingly. Those other two cases are just two other possible scenarios. In fact, that third one introduces an infinite number of scenarios. But the reason we want to presume, hey, Angela's indifference is just increasing in terms of bushels is just a simplifying assumption, because what this allows us to do is, oh, let's try that again, is by just increasing here, what that does is say, hey, anywhere along this dotted line would give us the same marginal rate of substitution for Angela. And that just allows it to be a lot easier to compare different outcomes for us. And so again, it's not that we would necessarily expect that some economic agent, Angela, only cares about one of these. This just allows us for a more simple analysis of this problem. So with that assumption in place, let's just clean this up and let's go take a look at our first case scenario, which would be that Angela is an independent farmer or that landowner. And we've actually looked at this already, so we'll go through it pretty quick. Again, let's clean up and have a look. Okay, so starting off, we have this scenario where Angela is the independent farmer, the landowner. She owns her land. She has her own trade-offs between the amount of free time she has and the amount of bushels of wheat which she grows. So, of course, that is her feasibility set. Her goal at this point would be to maximize her utility altogether. Let's use that right tool. There we go. Her goal would be to maximize that utility, get the highest possible indifference curve that she could, given her feasibility set. Of course, that takes place at the point where the marginal rate of substitution, this is her ability to switch between hours of free time and bushels of agriculture, such that she maintains some indifference curve, is equal to her marginal rate of transformation. The marginal rate of transformation is her ability to transform bushels into free time, or of course, the other way around, free time into bushels. So marginal rate of substitution, what she's willing to do to maintain her happiness. Marginal rate of transformation, what she's capable of doing given her feasibility set. Altogether, we see right there approximately is where we get the two curves just kissing each other. That is on indifference curve 4, so that's the highest one that she could possibly obtain. And at this indifference curve of 4, she would be working for 8 hours. So she would have working 8 hours, having 16 hours of free time a day. And as a result of that, brings us there. What would that give us? If that's 25 and that is 50, we could say that this here is approximately, let's say this is about 46 bushels of grain altogether that she is able to produce. So there we go. As an independent farmer and as a landowner, she just seeks to utilize her land in such a way as to make her the best off that she could possibly be, and chooses her combination of hours of free time, which would then the other side be the number of hours she works, to the number of bushels that she's going to harvest, and in such a way that she gets the highest possible indifference curve. To quickly talk about the marginal rate of substitution, the marginal rate of transformation, and take a look at why this is the maximum, let's take a look at each side of it. Let's start off by taking a look at 12 bushels of grain altogether. And if we were at that point there, let's just change the color. Let's use red. So at 12 being somewhere about here, so yes, she's getting more time working. She's working 12 hours a day, so significantly less free time, but is able to get significantly more bushels of wheat. Why might she not want to be at this point here? Well, what we see at this point is that she has, let's just zoom in here, and I'll have to zoom back out later, so let's just zoom in. Okay, at this point, she has her marginal rate of transformation, which I'll do in a white line. Let's see if I can do that a bit better. There we go. That's the slope of her marginal rate of transformation, the slope of her feasibility set. Meanwhile, let's switch that to blue for her indifference curve. She has a marginal rate of substitution that is like that. That is, her marginal rate of substitution is much steeper. So altogether, she has a marginal rate of substitution that is bigger, steeper than her marginal rate of transformation. To put it another way, let's say this is something like she would, just to maintain, because of how much free time she's given up, with how many bushels she's producing, she would have a marginal rate of substitution of 10 to 1 versus a marginal rate of transformation of, I don't know, let's say 5 to 1. Okay, that's bigger, but you're like, Keith, 10 to 1, 5 to 1, what? Again, this is our slope, so rise over run. So marginal rate of substitution would be 10 bushels per hour of free time versus 5 bushels per hour of free time. Keep in mind, these are downward sloping, so they are negative. So let's go and say, here we go, negative for the top, positive for the denominator, thus giving us a negative value in the end. What does this say? Well, it's saying to gain 1 hour of free time to maintain her happiness on indifference curve 3, she would be willing to give up 10 bushels. So she would be just as happy to get an hour of free time and have 10 bushels fewer of wheat. However, she is capable of gaining an hour of free time and only giving up 5 bushels of wheat. So she was willing to give up 10 bushels to gain an hour. She's capable of giving up 5 bushels to gain an hour. What should she do? Well, she should gain an hour of free time, and she is up 5 bushels more than what she was willing. So she's better off. She gets to go to a higher indifference curve as a result. So she's happier. She's better off with this altogether. So that's the case where marginal rate of substitution is greater than the marginal rate of transformation. Of course, we could look at the opposite scenario altogether, and let's just quickly clean up and do that. Okay, in this case, let's suppose that she finds herself somewhere like this. So with 20 hours of free time, that is, she's only working for 4 hours. And with this 20 hours of free time, she's able to produce, it's a little bit cut off. Let's just move over here a little bit, 25 bushels of wheat. Okay, well, what's happening here? Well, at this point, we see that her marginal rate of transformation based off of the feasibility set is going to be quite steep. Meanwhile, using blue for the indifference curve, the marginal rate of substitution is going to be quite shallow at this point. So what's happening between those two? The steeper one means a bigger value. This would mean that our marginal rate of substitution is less than our marginal rate of transformation. And again, if we just to put some made up numbers to these, just so we can think through this, walk through this, talk through this, let's say that we have a marginal rate of substitution of 8 to 1 versus a marginal rate of transformation of, let's say, 12 to 1. And Keith, where did these numbers come from? I don't know. I just made them up. The only reason that I had to have these in this set way is I had to set this value less than that value because that was the inequality we've stated we've had. I could have picked any numbers such that this was true. Marginal rate of substitution less than rate of transformation. Again, what are we talking about? 8 to 1, 12 to 1? We are talking about bushels per hour of free time, bushels per hour of free time. And again, these are negative. So that is, they have to have opposite signs across the divisor. So in this case here, let's go opposite signs across the divisor. Let's put positive, negative. Let's put positive and let's clean that up, positive and negative. There we go. So what it's saying is she would be willing to give up an hour of free time and gain 8 bushels of agriculture. Doing so would move her along her indifference curve. However, she is capable of giving up an hour of free time and getting 12 bushels. That is what would do along the feasibility set. So she's willing to give up an hour of free time to get 8. She's capable of giving up an hour to get 12. Well, hey, in this case here, she is 4 bushels of wheat better off than what she was willing. So what should she do? She should give up hours of free time and move that way. By doing so, she's capable of getting to higher levels of indifference curves, and as a result of that, moves from this point here on indifference curve 3 towards that point there on indifference curve 4. So altogether, again, our maximizing situation where she's the best off she could possibly be is where marginal rate of substitution equals marginal rate of transformation. And we've done this a few times, but just again, for the benefit of everybody, explained why we move towards equalizing these whenever there is a difference between them. Okay, so let's just zoom back out here. What we've looked at is the case of the independent farmer, where Angela both owns the land, all of this land, and so her decision is just entirely, hey, because I own this land, how do I utilize it, giving up my free time to get the fruits of the land in such a way to maximize my utility altogether. And we see that she does it by equating her marginal rate of substitution to marginal rate of transformation, and thus gets to indifference curve 4. By getting to indifference curve 4, she is the best off she could possibly be. She has 16 hours of free time, that is, she works for 8, and she produces 46 bushels of wheat. So that's our first case scenario, when you just have the owner taking care of it and maximizing based off of what they own. Let's take a look at another situation. Let's introduce Bruno now, and let's take a look at forced labor. So let's clean up and reevaluate. Okay, so in this case, we have a scenario where Bruno is the landowner and Angela is essentially just subjected to forced labor. That is, Bruno can entirely decide how much free time Angela gets, and then based off the free time that Angela gets, the amount of bushels of wheat that are grown from her labor. Now, it may seem like Bruno can just pick anywhere in here, but that's not quite the case. Even in these scenarios of forced labor, Angela has her reservation indifference curve. That is the lowest level of utility in which she will put up with the forced labor. At some point, even despite the risks, despite all of the rest, it is worth for her to try to escape, to try to look for something else, anything else. Get out of this forced labor slavery situation. And as horrible as this is, we can look through history in cases where we did have forced labor and slavery and see where this was the case and that this does hold, that there was a minimum level of utility, minimum indifference curve, such that as long as they were provided some level of free time, some amount of bushels of wheat, presumably to eat in this case here, they would continue to willfully subject themselves to this forced labor. If if we end up in a situation where we attempt to, let's say, do something like this, Bruno tries to get Angela to do 12 hours of work, that is only 12 hours of free time, and similarly, as a result of that, produce some amount of bushels, I don't know, maybe that's 20, we'll see that Angela will refuse this. And my apology, Angela is not producing 20, Angela is getting 20. Angela would be producing all the way up here. she would be producing something like, I don't know what that would be, 49, right? The result is Bruno would be getting 29 bushels of wheat and leaving 20 bushels of wheat for Angela for her own sustenance, her own ability to survive. In this case, Angela's reservation indifference curve is up here, meaning she would need, at 12 hours of free time, to be provided more bushels of wheat to make her indifferent between continuing to be subjected to forced labor or risk escape. And so in this case here, if Bruno were to set her free time at 12 and her compensation at 20, Angela would say, no, this is not worth this arrangement. I am better off risking capture, risking imprisonment, risking possibly death by trying to escape than continuing forced labor. So that is, even though it's slavery, even though it's forced labor, there's still a minimum indifference curve, a minimum utility that needs to be respected by Bruno in order to actually get production. Because if Bruno sets anything below this, essentially he's just going to get zero because Angela's going to escape and isn't going to provide this at all to Bruno. So it's not possible for Bruno to set anywhere down to the left of this reservation indifference curve. Let's clean up and talk about what that means on the other side then. What this really means is that Bruno has a feasible set of the amount of hours he can make Angela work and the corresponding amount of wheat that he gets based off of this area here in between the production possibility frontier, the white line, and Angela's reservation indifference curve, the blue line. This in-between area, we call this the lens of mutual benefit, such that ultimately anywhere in here, say we were able to find a point like such, well, at 16 hours of work is roughly where that is. Oh, let's use the right tool here. Not quite, but let's just move that over just so that I can keep my story. There we go, at 16 hours of work there. Angela gets a rent, that is her benefit above her reservation next best alternative. She gets a rent of that much wheat, and Bruno, as the landowner, gets a rent of that much wheat, such that they are both better off altogether. They both get some gains from trade. Now, of course, this is a slavery situation. So, being a slavery situation, Bruno wants to extract the most that he can, gets the most gains from this situation. And in this case, Bruno will get the most possible by setting some amount along Angela's indifference curve. So the result is that at any point, Bruno would receive the vertical distance between what the land is capable of producing and what Angela would need to receive to keep her from trying to escape. And we see that Bruno would get these vertical distances as his profit, his benefit from this arrangement. And so the question then is, if Bruno can pick any amount of hours to make Angela work, and thus any amount of bushels that he ends up collecting, well, producing, and then giving him the amount that he collects, where should he choose altogether? Well, what we can ultimately see with this is that the area where Bruno gets the biggest benefit, the biggest difference between the production possibility frontier and Angela's indifference curve is where they're the farthest apart. We can take a look at this if we were just to plot these vertical distances, and we would get something that looks like this. So let's just drag that guy down, something like that, something like that. We have the number of bushels that Bruno gets. So these are just Bruno's bushels. They're not the bushels that Angela gets, just the ones that Bruno gets. And we see that at the two extremes, right here, Bruno gets no bushels. Because at this point here, Bruno has to pay all the bushels that are grown to Angela to keep her from trying to escape. Similarly, at this other extreme, where Angela is getting lots of free time, Bruno is similarly getting no bushels because has to provide all those bushels to her to keep her from escaping. So in each of these scenarios, we get 0 bushels being collected altogether. As we increase our bushels from the first extreme, as we increase our hours of free time, give her more and more free time, she's willing to give up bushels of wheat. And so Bruno's reward increases, hits a maximum, and then decreases. We get a shape that looks something like this, such that initially Bruno's reward is increasing. He's getting more and more and more bushels. As free time increases, it hits a maximum. I'm sorry, I realized I didn't label this axis. This is hours of free time as well, sharing the same axes. So Bruno's reward increases as free time increases, hits a maximum, and then as Bruno provides more and more free time to Angela, she provides fewer and fewer and fewer bushels to him. So if Bruno wants to maximize his reward altogether, get the most that he can out of this slavery forced labor situation, Bruno would want to pick this point right here such that his return, his profits are maximized. Where is that point? There we go, somewhere just like that, cutting right through 16 hours of free time. That is, Angela altogether will be working for 8 hours, and then that yields for Bruno altogether 46 bushels being produced. Although 46 bushels are being produced, he has to pay Angela, that is, at least that amount of food that Angela would need to not try to escape. And so what we get altogether, let's just put some value to that. If this is 25, let's say this is something like, I don't know, we can say this is 23. Actually, if that's 25, that's definitely not 23. Maybe this is something like 16, just to make a nice round number. Okay. So if this is the situation, then Angela gets her wage, even though you're like, wait, this is forced labor, this is slave labor. Yes, but Angela still needs to be paid some amount of bushels for food, for care, all the rest to keep her from escaping, such that she would get 16 bushels for her labor. And Bruno collects the difference. Bruno would then collect this 16 to 46. So the 30 is what Bruno takes as his reward, the amount of bushels that he gets from Angela's forced labor. This would be our maximizing point. Now, where does this relate to the whole thing? If we back up, let's keep in mind that we said, okay, indifference curves only increase in terms of bushels. So any point on this indifference curve is the same marginal rate of substitution as the indifference curve goes up. And previously, when Angela was just having herself as an independent farmer, she was similarly willing to have 16 hours of free time, but she was similarly going to extract that 46 bushels all for herself. Her being a landowner, her deciding this is where I'm going to maximize on my own. In this case, we still end up in the same amount of free time, same amount of total bushels being produced. In this case, the distribution is just different. Now Bruno is being the slave owner, is getting 30 of those, with Angela only getting 16. Why is this maximized? Because right at this maximum point, still just the same, we have, based off of our indifference curve, we have our marginal rate of substitution. Based off of our production possibility frontier, we have our marginal rate of transformation. And again, at this point, they are going to be the same value. Now, keep in mind, this isn't going to be a higher indifference curve that Angela gets to because Bruno is always just going to capture any of the extra, so she cannot get to higher indifference curves. But just the same, when those two are equal, marginal rate of substitution to marginal rate of transformation, Bruno altogether has maximized the exploitation of Angela, and thus is getting the highest return possible for him. Again, just to quickly evaluate this, just from one scenario, let's suppose that Bruno initially figures that he just needs to work Angela very, very hard, get the most that he can. So if he does so, let's use red for that, makes Angela work for 12 hours altogether. Now, okay, yes, making Angela work for 12 hours provides more bushels altogether, but needs to pay Angela more bushels too in order to keep her from escaping. Well, what we can see is if we go and just say, well, what is Bruno's payoff? Bruno's payoff is that bit there. Let's use a different color actually, just so that we can see this a bit differently. Let's use green for Bruno. Why not? There we go. So if that's Bruno's payoff, the difference between what he gets from the production and what Angela receives from the production, what we can see is if we just drag this over to that point there, we see that Bruno's actually getting less altogether than he would have if he had just had Angela work 8 hours. So actually by increasing Angela's work time, Bruno is decreasing his overall reward. He would be better off, Bruno would be better off by having Angela work less and thus needing to compensate her less, and thus Bruno would be better off. Now, how does that work with this whole marginal rate of substitution, marginal rate of transformation business? Okay, at 12, what do we have? At 12, we have a fairly shallow marginal rate of transformation, but we have a fairly steep marginal rate of substitution. So that is our marginal rate of substitution is greater than that marginal rate of transformation. Again, just to make up numbers to throw to that, this would be 10 to 1. Sorry, that doesn't look like a 10. Let's try that again. 10 to 1 versus our rate of transformation maybe being 6 to 1. Okay, again, this is bushels per hour of free time, bushels per hour of free time. Marginal rate of substitution, this is what Angela is willing to do to keep her from running away. This is what she is capable of doing in terms of actual output. Okay, and thus what Bruno gets. So in this case here, again, downward sloping, so we have to have opposite signs across the divisors. So in this case here, let's go positive, negative, negative, positive, and say, okay, in order to keep her from running away, we could give her 10 bushels fewer and allow her an extra hour of free time for herself. If we were to do that, if we were to give her an extra hour of free time, she would only make 6 bushels less for us. So she was willing to get an hour of free time for 10 bushels, but we can give her an hour of free time and only lose 6 bushels, meaning Bruno in this case here, Bruno gets 4 bushels by giving Angela an hour of free time. Bruno wins by giving Angela more free time. So in order to maximize Bruno's payoff, Bruno should provide more free time to Angela, and that is continue until that marginal rate of substitution is equated to the marginal rate of transformation. So that is, even though Angela is restricted, even though Angela is minimized to her reservation indifference curve, the lowest level of utility that she would need to require to actually work and not just try to run away and escape, even though this scenario exists, our maximizing, our optimizing scenario still takes place where the marginal rate of substitution equals the marginal rate of transformation. The big difference here is instead of Angela just getting all of this benefit, getting everything, we now have a distributional impact where Angela is only getting 16 bushels and Bruno, by utilizing her forced labor, extracts 30 bushels of wheat from her. So we see the impact of forced or slave labor. Okay. What happens though if we have government and government comes in and says, hey, slavery is wrong, rightfully so, and by making slavery wrong, we say, Bruno, you can't just do that. You have to actually offer Angela some amount for her work, and then she has the option to either take the amount that you've offered her or leave it and go try to work for somebody else. That is, she's not forced to work for you, Bruno. She could go somewhere else if she wanted. If that's the case, how does that change things at all? Or if at all? And let's go evaluate that. We'll have to clean up, of course, but let's clean up, come back and take a look at the take it or leave it contract. Okay, in this case, we'll take a look at the take it or leave it contract. So in this case, we no longer have forced labor. Angela is free to choose to work for Bruno or go work for some other farm landowner that's out there. So she at least has a lot more freedom and ability of choice in this case. The result of that is that her indifference curve, her reservation indifference curve, has shifted up. Ooh, let's use a different tool there. Has shifted up altogether because now she has those other options. It's not, oh, my other option, my next best alternative is trying to escape and evade the law and the risk of being captured and all the rest. No, no, no. Angela's now free to choose. So she now has easier ability to choose to work for a different farmer, to work a different plot of land. So her lowest level of utility, her reservation indifference curve, is going to be higher as a result. What this gives us then is similarly, because we had this presumption that her indifference curves, her utility only increases in terms of bushels of agriculture, we still have the point. We have our marginal rate of transformation based off of our feasibility set, based off our production possibility frontier. We have our marginal rate of substitution based off of her new utility or new indifference curve, that reservation one. And of course, anywhere between point A and point B, we get all together everywhere between B and A. These are all of our Pareto efficient distributions of how we could split this 46 up between Bruno and Angela in order to have a Pareto efficient distribution. Now, keep in mind, whichever one we end up with may or may not be fair, but it would be the Pareto efficient. In this case, our take it or leave it contract is very much just our ultimatum game. So we took a look at this ultimatum game earlier in game theory, and in this case, we have our proposer, which is Bruno, which has ultimately 46 bushels available for him to decide how to distribute. He can decide, okay, I am going to keep some amount for myself and offer some amount to Angela. Keeping in mind, we've just come to the point where we're saying, hey, ultimatum is based off of this 46, but we reason why it's the 46 is because this is where it's the biggest benefit altogether to Bruno. And we've looked at this in the past with the slavery situation, and same thing would hold. If we found ourselves at a different point, say we tried to get more altogether, so here we go, something like this, maybe that's now something like 49 bushels of wheat being provided. Well, although 49 bushels being provided altogether, Bruno would be able to get less because of this indifference curve. Angela would demand more to actually accept the ultimatum. So the place where Bruno can get the largest return from the ultimatum is when we are at 16 hours of free time and 46 bushels. So based off of that, Bruno makes an offer. And of course, Bruno could offer anything from 46 all the way down to Angela's minimum indifference point, and that is based off of her reservation price, the indifference curve. And in that scenario there, we would have, let's say, 23. So if Bruno were to offer something, let's say Bruno's being very generous, this wouldn't be very maximizing of him. But if he were to offer 40 to Angela, that is essentially saying, Angela, you get 40, Bruno, Bruno will only take 16. Well, that would put us somewhere like this. And in that case there, Angela would get 40. She would receive an economic rent of 40 minus 23. So what's that? 17 would be her economic rent. Bruno would receive this 16 and thus receive his economic rent. And both of them would be earning something in this case. And Angela would definitely be accepting this because it's better off than anything else that she would have. However, let's clean this up and take a look at the reality of the situation. The reality of the situation is that, well, this lowest indifference curve is the point where she is entirely indifferent between working for Bruno or working for her next best alternative for another farmer. And so if Bruno knows this, Bruno can actually get away with giving an offer of 23 and saying, hey, you get to work the land, you get to keep 23 bushels, and I'll get the rest. That is, take it or leave it. You get 23 bushels for working, and I'll get everything left over from that. Or I'm going to just charge however much you decide to produce. Bruno says, I'm going to take 23. So if Bruno takes 23, there we go. There's Bruno's 23. This then leaves 23 for Angela. Will Angela accept that? Well, yeah, Angela will accept it because it's on her indifference curve as to where she would feasibly be willing to produce. And so we would have this breakdown in this case of 23 bushels being provided to Bruno, 23 being provided to Angela. And in this case here, Bruno gets his profit, his economic rent of 23 units, and Angela gets economic rent of 0. Angela's getting economic rent of 0 because she's getting no benefit in terms of bushels above her minimum reservation option, which is the reservation option between this or her next best alternative as to another job available to her. So yes, this is great. This is Angela's working. She's free to make her choices. She's better off than what she was underneath the forced labor scenario, but it's still very much in this take it or leave it contract. If Bruno is able to identify that minimum, that indifference point for Angela, Bruno is able to exercise a lot of power in this and set the price, set the cost of this agreement equal to that 0 economic rent situation for Angela. And then in the same kind of way, entirely exploits her labor, leaves her with no economic rent whatsoever. One thing I want you to keep in mind is that, in fact, as we moved from forced labor to this take it or leave it contract, in many ways, our social surplus, that is the total rent, the total benefit that is shared by these two economic agents, that is the size of our pie, has shrunk. When we had forced labor, well, Bruno was able to get the difference between A all the way down to the forced labor indifference curve. So in this case here, we had this massive benefit all going to the landowner in this case here, which would have been the entirety of social surplus. Angela was getting right at her indifference point, right at the lowest amount she was willing to accept. And so there's no surplus that she's receiving. It's all being attributed to Bruno. What we see is as we've moved to this take it or leave it situation, we now have this lower amount of benefit, lower amount gains from trade available altogether. Yes, Angela is better off, but still getting 0 economic rent versus her alternatives, and Bruno's still capturing the entirety of all the surplus. So really the thing that I want to get ahead with this, point out with this, is the difference between us talking about gains or economic surplus and the distribution of that, but also just taking a look at the fairness situation. We can all pretty much agree now today that forced labor is a big problem and not something that we should entertain. But you can see quite easily in this situation how, if you had an economist in this time, could have quite easily argued that the abolishment of slavery actually meant a loss to society, actually meant less economic activity being captured, and as a result, we were all worse off because of it, because our pie was shrinking. So that is to say, yes, these whole idea of the distribution, this idea as to how much surplus is being received, it can really be used for nefarious ends. And so while it's true that that surplus, that total economic activity was greater, all being attributed to Bruno, was greater in the case of forced labor, well, hopefully we can all agree that it's a bit more of a fair outcome, although it's less, but a bit more of a fair outcome for Angela to be having the freedom to choose which farmer she works for, even in this take it or leave it kind of contract scenario. So to summarize this again quickly, what was the big outcome? Well, the first big outcome is versus forced labor. Angela has a higher reservation and difference curve because she has better options available to her. She's not stuck working for just Bruno. She could go and work for another farmer. So indifference curve goes up because the next best alternative is potentially higher. So minimum that she would work for Bruno. We're going to pick the amount of free time such that the marginal rate of transformation equals the marginal rate of substitution, because when that's the case, the distance between our feasibility set, our production possibility frontier, and Angela's indifference curve is the largest. So being the largest, we have the largest possible gains from trade to be had between, well, what Bruno could collect and what Angela would require to actually make her work. In this case, if Bruno can identify Angela's indifference curve and identify her minimum willingness to accept, Bruno has all the power to set this at her lowest willingness to accept, such that she's getting zero economic rent, and Angela's no worse off. So she has no incentive to refuse this because any other alternative leaves her worse off than this. She has zero economic rent. So, I mean, I guess she could go work for another farmer and get the same thing. So there's no reason why she would refuse in that case at all. But what we see is that in this take it or leave it contract, in this ultimatum game, when the proposer is able to identify the minimum accepted offer that the offerer will accept, the proposer has all the power, can set that at the minimum and capture the most that they possibly can. Let's see if this changes things a bit. If instead of just offering, hey, this take it or leave it, we can negotiate a tenancy agreement. That is, just say, hey, here you go, Angela. You're allowed to work the land. You can produce as much as you want or as little as you want. You just need to pay rent. You just need to lease the land and work out what the price of that lease is going to be. Let's go jump over. Let's take a look at this scenario with the tenancy agreement. So a different rule of the game. Let's go take a look. Okay, so in this case here, we have a tenancy agreement. So instead of Bruno just saying, hey, take it or leave it, Angela, this is how much you get to keep, and there you go, that's it. Work this many hours for me, keep this amount, and go from there. Ultimatum game going on. Tenancy agreement, really we get potentially a very similar outcome. In this case, underneath the tenancy agreement, is Bruno says to Angela, go and produce whatever you want, but your lease is 23 bushels of wheat. So essentially, the land is capable of producing along that dashed line there. That is our production possibility frontier. However, whatever Angela chooses for free time, thus whatever Angela chooses for work, correspondingly gives what Angela's take home is, which would be whatever the land could produce minus the 23 bushels, the vertical distance at all points here is that leaf. And so based off of this, just like going back to our first case here, Angela would just go to find the highest possible indifference curve that she could, given the feasibility set that she's facing. And in this case, she's just facing this constrained feasibility set, the actual feasibility set of the land, minus the corresponding leaf. And so in this case here, just like in every other case, Angela would go and equate her marginal rate of substitution to her marginal rate of transformation. That is where the slope of her feasibility set equals the slope of her indifference curve. And we would get all together for Angela 16 hours of free time. And similarly, cut that guy across. Let's use the right tool. Something, again, I'm just making this number up, something like 23 units being produced. So in this case here, what is happening? Well, she's producing 23 units. She has her lease of 23 bushels. How much would she be producing altogether? At 16, all the way up to right there. She's capable of producing 46. She's keeping 23. What's happening to the rest? Well, this 23 there, that vertical distance, that is the lease that she has to pay to Bruno for her right to work this land. So again, we just see a different rule, a different way to organize this agreement between the owner of the land and the one who ends up working it, and how, depending on how we set it up, we can get the exact same outcome for Angela in terms of the amount of time she ends up working, her reward versus Bruno's reward. Again, what we want to keep in mind is that ultimately, anywhere in between this point, we'll call that point A, this point, we'll call that point B. So that is anywhere between A and B along that vertical line. That vertical line there would be our Pareto efficient frontier. We could pick any point between A and B and have Pareto efficiency. However, Bruno would always want the incentive to push it down to the lowest price that Angela would be willing to accept. Angela, of course, would like to push it up to the highest amount that Bruno would be willing to accept. And ideally, we'd end up in the middle, but in both 2, 3, and 4, we've looked at situations where Bruno has had all the power, and thus Bruno has been able to push this price all the way down to Angela's willingness to accept, and thus allows Bruno to capture the entirety of the surplus for himself. What happens, though, if we engage in this democratic ability to change the rules? And that is, let's say Angela binds together with a whole bunch of other farmhands. There's much more of them than there are of Bruno and the farm owners. And they say, enough's enough. We're going to change the rules of the game such that the government sets conditions on it, hopefully working out in our favor. And by our favor, I mean the laborers' favor. And so let's take a look at a potential solution, a potential outcome that may take effect if we are able to change the legislation, change those rules, and then go about this process through that. Still presuming Bruno has the power in the situation. So Bruno still gets to push down to Angela's willingness to accept, but Angela, using her political power, is able to change the rules of the game, at least in her favor. So a bit of a balancing of power there. Let's go jump over and take a look at that outcome. Okay, so before we take a look at 5, which is the democratic ability to change the rules of the game, let's just backtrack and talk about why anywhere along this kind of highlighted line between what I have been calling A and B. Let's just throw A and B back up there so we're sure where we're referencing. Point A and point B. Why any point between A and B must be a Pareto efficient outcome. What we got to keep in mind is that a Pareto efficient outcome, the only definition of Pareto efficiency is that there's no possible Pareto improvement. That is, if we find ourselves somewhere here, there's no way to move to another spot, which makes one person better off without making another worse off. In order to see that, let's pick something within this lens of mutual benefit and see why wherever we pick, we would be better off being somewhere here. And so to start off, let's pick something like this. There we go. So we picked this point, and so there we go. We have roughly 23 bushels, and I don't know, maybe that's 21 hours of free time. So you know what? Maybe let's be a bit more. Let's go on the other side. We'll call that point C. And so if we were just to drag out, see where this is, that is, again, what did I say? 23 bushels and something like, we'll say, approximately 20 hours of free time. Question is, why would we be better on here than we are at C? Well, what we can do to evaluate this is go and say, well, clearly at point C, we're on a higher indifference curve. So Angela's clearly better off at C than she is at B. So let's take this indifference curve and let's move it up to pass through C. There we go. Okay. Then we can say, well, Angela would be indifferent between being at C or being at some point here. We can call that D. Should be absolutely indifferent to that because, well, it's the same indifference curve. But what about Bruno? So, okay, just to back up again, what I could say is anywhere between B and D is an improvement from B, right? Because she has higher utility. From C, anywhere D or higher is a higher utility for Angela, so she'd be better off. Okay, what about Bruno? Well, from Bruno's perspective, let's take a look at what Bruno's payoff is. And let's use this green for Bruno. Bruno is getting the difference between what Angela receives at C and the feasibility set. So that's the distance that Bruno is receiving altogether. Well, at C, that's what he gets. If we move up and say we come up here to this, what I'm calling our Pareto efficient set, we see that, hey, at point D, Bruno would be receiving far more than what he is at C. So that is, if we started at C and we moved up to the left, point D or higher, we must be better off. In fact, both would be better off if we moved up into this area. As a result, what we get is Pareto improvement being possible from point C, such that we can move up into this area and make at least one better off without making anyone worse off. And that gives us D as an improvement such that Bruno wins, but Angela's no worse off. Or alternatively, right there, go something like that. I can call that E. C to E is such that Angela is better off. It would be a higher indifference curve going through E. So Angela would be better off at E, but Bruno is no worse off. Altogether, what we get is from point C there, if we draw kind of a triangle like this, we could end up anywhere, absolutely anywhere within this triangle. And anywhere in this triangle would be a Pareto improvement over C, with the highest possible Pareto improvement being somewhere on this line, E to D. And what I could do is I could pick any point off this AB line, and similarly find some Pareto improvement that would be on that AD line. Thus, the result of that is that this AD line is our Pareto efficient frontier. We always have points on here that are Pareto improvements, but we can never go from anywhere on here to anywhere else. There's no Pareto improvements possible from points on this AB line. Thus, it's the highest we could possibly get. Okay. That being said, let's talk about five. Let's talk about this democratic ability to change the rules. Let's clean this up and look at what we could do. And since we have it down here already, let's just say that Angela and her friends, so Angela and all of her other voters, they find a sympathetic political party who is willing to put in the following rules. Willing to say that your maximum work is 4 hours. So here we go. The maximum amount you're allowed to work is 4 hours. Furthermore, they set that the minimum wage, so the minimum amount that you have to be paid for your 4 hours of work, is 23 bushels. That is, so to say, has said C is the minimum that we could possibly get to. Of course, you're free to work less than 4 hours, and of course, you're free to earn a wage higher than 23 bushels, but C is legally the most you're allowed to work and the lowest wage you're allowed to receive. Well, just like what we were looking at, in essence, what this does is it provides a new minimum reservation. So this is the new minimum reservation. Let's just move this up. And I guess one of the questions is, why is this a new minimum reservation indifference curve instead of just being, hey, a higher indifference curve? Well, the reason this would be a new minimum, the lowest possible reservation indifference curve we could get, is because this is now the law. So that is, if Angela tries to get somewhere below this indifference curve, that is, tries to get somewhere at B, well, hey, that would be below the legal indifference curve that she could obtain. She would just go to another employer who was following the law and offering her some combination of free time and wage that gave her on indifference curve N. So what result is that this existing indifference curve is just gone. It's no longer an option to us. This is now her lowest reservation. What we see is versus, let's just bring this up a little bit here. You might not have even noticed that. This was our slavery indifference curve. We've noticed that as we put in different rules of the game that favor laborers, favor the ones working, the ones that don't have as much typical power in the negotiation process, we have been able to obtain higher and higher possible utilities for them. However, this has been at the expense of a smaller and smaller feasible set. That is the area in this lens of mutual benefit. What used to be all the way to A to B as our potential Pareto efficient set now decreases to there, and something like that would be our marginal rate of substitution equals marginal rate of transformation. Let's just bring that up there to note it. And so B goes up as such. So our Pareto efficient frontier collapses as well. But here's also part of the issue, is you're only allowed to work 4 hours a day. So in fact, we can't even get to this Pareto efficient frontier based off of this, because to go any further that way would be more hours of work. That is, to get to 16, that would be 8 hours of work altogether, which is illegal. We've said the maximum workday is only 4 hours a day. So the result of this altogether is that we get this, let's use red, a boundary like that, saying, hey, you cannot go to the left of that boundary. Very similarly, we have set a boundary for the minimum wage, saying you cannot pay less than 23. So not only have we restricted this feasible set altogether, we have restricted it even farther by saying the only feasible set that we can engage in is this area here. This is the only area where we could potentially have gains from trade, such that the ability to produce is above the minimum indifference curve of our next best alternative. So significantly smaller area to have gains. Based off of this, the other issue that we end up seeing is at this point, well, if we are at 20 hours of free time, so 4 hours of work, we have our marginal rate of substitution, but we have our marginal rate of transformation, which is much steeper. So marginal rate of transformation is greater than our marginal rate of substitution. We aren't at a maximizing point. This isn't the biggest point that we could get. But this would be the best we could do, the closest we could get to a maximizing point. Anything else would be significantly less. And we can just quickly test this to see. Now let's just take a look at that. So to test this, let's use green again to test this. Here we go at 20 hours of work. Let's make that just a little bit bigger so that we can see it easier. Let's change that to 5. There we go. At 20 hours of work, that is the total gains from trade. The difference between what is capable of being produced and what is the minimum that is willing to be received. Any point to the right of this, you will see, would actually be less gains from trade than at 20 hours of work. So although the marginal rate of substitution is although the marginal rate of substitution is less than the marginal rate of transformation, they are the closest together that they could possibly be given our constraints, the red lines. As a result, we will end up right at the maximum amount that you're allowed to work and the minimum wage that you're allowed to pay. And as a result of that, Bruno will push the wage still down to 23. We'll say you can only work 4 hours because legally that's all I can let you work. As a result, Angela gets to take home 23 bushels of wheat, and Bruno takes home, what does that look like? I take a look at that, and that looks something like, well, if that's 25, I'm just freehanding here. Let's say this is something like, which means Bruno is only getting to collect profit of 5 bushels based off of this, with the wage going to Angela of 23. Altogether, that entire amount being produced, being divided between our two economic agents, is 28, far less than the 46. However, we see that Angela is no worse off. It's just Bruno who ultimately is stuck with lower profits because of this law, because of this rule altogether, and thus the social payoff is much, much smaller. So we can do things like that. We can put in a minimum wage. We can put in a maximum number of hours worked. All this does is restrict our feasibility set, restricts our lens of mutual gain to being this tiny little area here. And while we can still have maybe what we would denote as a more fair outcome, it, in this case, is far from what we would say is an efficient outcome. And so potential drawback that we could have with this. However, what I want you to keep in mind is that if we had a scenario where we dictated that the maximum number of hours you could work was 12 with a minimum wage of 23, well, in this case here, we would be back just to where we used to be, because that would be lower than what was available to us, what we were willing to do underneath the take or leave it or tenancy agreement. So it really does depend on where this feasibility set works out versus that Pareto efficient point. And let's just quickly evaluate that just to make sure we're clear and all on the same page. Okay, so if the government dictated that the maximum number of hours that you could work was 12, so let's put that in here. Let's go again, use red for that. So maximum number of time that you could work is 12 hours. So here you go. This is your work time of 12. similarly dictates that you have to provide a minimum wage of 23. Well, as long as you're up to the right of that, you're fine. What this does in this scenario is it restricts our feasibility set. Our feasibility set is still small. It's no longer that entire lens of mutual benefit. It's now just this area here. Let's maybe just shade this in a little bit. We now just have this area here as our lens of mutual benefit. Everything above that minimum wage to the right of the number of hours that we are allowed to work max, above our indifference curve, but below our production possibility frontier. So anywhere in there is a possible combination of free time and wage available to us. What we see altogether, though, based off of this, is we are able to obtain somewhere along our Pareto efficient frontier where the marginal rate of transformation equals the marginal rate of substitution. So we will be somewhere between A and B because this is our maximizing point. If we go and lean on to what we've been saying, which is Bruno has all the power in setting this, well then just like before, Bruno will set that wage all the way down to the legislated minimum, which is also based off of the indifference curve of Angela, the minimum wage Angela would accept. And as a result, Bruno would similarly, in this case here, extract all of that surplus, all of that profit for himself. So in this case, although there was the ability to have these rules of the game set, setting maximum work hours, setting a minimum wage, they have no binding effect on the outcome in this scenario because it set the max work hours too high, set the wage too low versus what was already happening. So just because we set the law doesn't mean it will always change the outcomes. And this is the example of that. Let's go back up though. Let's go talk about the case where we did have that restriction and ways that we could negotiate better outcomes from 5. And I don't want this case, let's talk about a worse outcome such that we were restricted. So let's clean up and let's go back to that. Okay, so let's evaluate a negotiated outcome from this scenario where we put in minimum wage, we put in maximum work hours such that we've been unable to obtain our Pareto efficient set. What we can then say is, sure, we put on this law. We've said you're only allowed to work 4 hours a day. You must be paid at least 23 bushels. Let's say we also put in a clause saying, sure, you can deviate from this as long as the employee can always decide to return to this. So that is, you can't negotiate an outcome that makes the employee any worse off than this scenario. Well, if that's the case, essentially what it's saying is that you must have, if you were to negotiate another outcome, it must be a Pareto improvement from point C. That is maximum work of 4 hours, a minimum wage of 23 bushels. We can work out what that potential, where we could work out this negotiated outcome all together. And let's take a look at that. In fact, let's just zoom in because it's a bit of a small diagram and allows us to focus in on what we're looking at a bit better. Okay, so right now what we have is we're at point C. What is Bruno getting at point C? Well, Bruno, again, let's use green for Bruno. Bruno is receiving between what is produced and what Bruno has to pay to Angela. So that line there, that is Bruno's payoff, that's Bruno's profit. As we move along and Angela decides to work more, we produce more, and as a result, there is more to be split between them. So if we were able to negotiate all the way to this Pareto improvement point, what we get is this is Bruno's payoff at point C. So anywhere going from See, up to there, Bruno is no worse off along that line. Anywhere along that line, Bruno's still getting that green payoff, which would be the vertical distance between that production possibility frontier and this new white line that we've drawn. Let's call that, let's call that, that is A prime. So anywhere along this line, Bruno is no worse off. Similarly, we don't have to do anything that fancy for Angela. We have Angela's indifference curve, such that we know all the points that Angela is no worse off. And we already have right there B, which is the point which Angela would be at. Now what we can do is we can negotiate an outcome anywhere in this triangle A to C to B, and anywhere in that triangle, let's just flesh that triangle out, anywhere in this ACB triangle, we have a improvement, a Pareto improvement from C such that somebody wins and no one is necessarily worse off. Ultimately, the best outcome altogether would be to be on this Pareto efficient frontier ultimately between A prime and B. Of course, Bruno would want to negotiate, Bruno would want to set the wage as close to B as possible, because as a result, Bruno's profit is the largest it could be. Angela, alternatively, would want to negotiate, would want to push that wage as close to A prime as possible, making Bruno no worse off than that government legislated outcome, but capturing all of those benefits for the laborer, for the worker. Where the two parties ultimately end up between A prime and B will, of course, depend on their relative negotiating strength, their relative negotiating power and ability, and thus gives us that corresponding wage and corresponding outcome. This is one of your arguments for having organized labor, for having unions, because what ends up happening is if you just have your large employer, Bruno, who has all that power and ability to coordinate, well, Bruno has the ability, the incentive to push the wage all the way to B, capturing that all for him or herself. Alternatively, when Angela's just Angela, she doesn't have as much negotiating power to push that wage up. However, if Angela is part of a larger organized bloc, a larger cohesive voice, is able to show stronger negotiating power, as a result of that, Angela is able to negotiate a wage that is higher than B, potentially all the way up to A prime, capturing what would have been received by Bruno, such that the laborers win versus that government legislated outcome. Bruno is still no worse off than that government legislated outcome. If they get somewhere in the middle, technically they've both won. They're both better off versus that government legislated outcome, and that's cause for celebration. But that can only happen if there is actually somewhat balanced argument, balanced ability to negotiate between both the employer and the employee. If the employer has all the power, they push it all the way down. If the employee has all the power, they push it all the way up. Big thing to keep in mind, though, is if we are truthfully looking for Pareto improvements, as long as you're pushing it all the way up to A prime or all the way down to B, no one is worse off than C. It's just all about the distributional, it's all about the notion of fairness as to whether or not it's a fair outcome between A prime and B. Okay, so all of that covers very a select few cases where we had 6 different rules of the game around who owns, who operates, how we arrive at different wages, different agreements between the owner of the land, the one who then produces the goods based off of using the owner's resources, and the different distributions of income based off of that. That's really the big thing that we're getting at with this is recognizing how by changing the rules of the game, we can change the distribution of income between the owner of an asset and then the laborer who utilizes that asset to make the good, make the ultimately the bushels of wheat that everybody needs. And that is how the change in the rules of the game affects the distributional aspects. The question then is if we look at countries on whole, well, what is the distributional layout and where is that? Are countries more on the fair side or more on the unfair side altogether? And to evaluate that, we need to kind of take a look at these levels of income inequality and how incomes are distributed across a nation on whole. To take a look at this, one of the big ways we can do it is looking at what we would call a Lorenz curve. And from a Lorenz curve, we can figure out what we would call the Gini coefficient, which is just another way that we can easily compare inequalities across countries or across regions. Let's take a look at what's going on there. Okay, so the idea of the Lorenz curve is we can take a look at the percent of the population and what correspondingly is the percent of income which they earn. If we had a perfectly equal society, we would have something that looks like this. And let's talk through what this means. So starting off, population 25%. So what this means is that the bottom 25% of income earners earn 25% of the income. The bottom half of the population earns 50% of the income. The bottom 75 earns 75% of the income. Now, of course, this would be if we had a perfectly equal society. Most don't look like this. So what may be actually more what we would expect to see for a Lorenz curve, and what we get is something a bit more along these lines. So in this case, we have some artificial Lorenz curve in blue and just entirely something that I made up. But how exactly would we interpret this? Well, the way that we would interpret this is we would say, okay, the bottom 25% of the population, well, they earn, we could go bottom 25% up to the Lorenz curve, bring that across, and we would say, well, okay, 25 is there. Maybe that is approximately 10% of the population. So the bottom quarter only actually earn about 10% of the total income altogether. Similarly, we could say, well, what do the bottom half earn? The lowest half of income earners, well, in this fictional Lorenz curve, we would say that the bottom half only earn, well, what if that's 25 and that's 10? Maybe this is 18%. So the poorest 50% only earn 18% of the total income within the country. That is, the other way to say it is that the top 50% of income earners, they would earn 82% of the income, going the other way, right? We carry on. What about the 75% of the population? So bottom 75%. In this scenario, the bottom 75% of income earners would, well, if that's 25, maybe this is 30. So 3/4 of the people in the population only earn about 1/3 of the total income, or to put it the other way, these top 25% of income earners earn 70% of the nation's income altogether. And you can see this kind of allows us to start taking a look at the distribution of incomes within a country, which is ultimately what we were kind of looking at in that previous model, is taking a look at between the owners, between the laborers, who got to get the most income as they pushed more towards one side or the other, towards the production possibility frontier or towards the reservation indifference curve in order to determine the share of income. In our case here, we get that the 90th percentile, so the top 10% of income, earns 75% of the income. My apologies. So that is 90% of people earn 75% of the income, or that top 10% earns 25%, which is wild in that case. So we can break it down in this way. We can take a look at some Lorenz curves and say, okay, what are the different impacts and what is the true distribution of income altogether within different countries? Let's go take a look at a few different Lorenz curves altogether and interpret what is actually happening here. Let's go take a look. Okay, so here we have two Gini, my apologies, I'm reading the term here. Here we have two Lorenz curves. Don't worry about these Gini coefficients just yet. We'll explain these later. But here we have two actual Lorenz curves for Canada, one on the top from the 1980s, the one on the bottom from 2020. Now, how exactly do we interpret these? Well, very similar to what we had just done. And that is, we can take a look at this and we can take and just say, okay, well, for some income decile, what do we mean by income decile? So one would be 10% of the population. So the bottom 10% of the population earns just over 0% of the income. Move forward to 2020 and still the bottom 10% still only earns just over 0%. Not great. Where do we start to pick up? Well, if we jump up and take a look here, we can say that in 1980s, here we go, let's say the bottom 40% of our population, so that guy up to there, well, the bottom 40%, let's maybe use a bit of a different tool. There we go. The bottom 40%, they accounted for about 12% of the national income. So not great. 40% of Canadians only accounting for 12% of the national income. I'm not sure if that's showing up properly. Let's make that a little bit darker. There we go, somewhere around there. So we see that 40%, about 12% of the income. Not great. Altogether, the next one up is that about 60% of the population, they earn, so 6 out of 10 people only earned 25% of Canada's income. The top 90% of income earners, accounted for about 67% of our total income, meaning that top 10% earned about 33% of our income. Now, how did it go from 1980 fast forward to today? Are we better off? Are we more equal? And I'm using a bit of a normative judgment there that more equal is better off. Many would argue that more equal, for many reasons, for social cohesion and more, is better, but it's a normative statement. Where would we be? Let's compare similar data points. So, bottom 40% of income earners, 2020, are now earning less than 12% of the population. Less than 12% of the income. My apologies. So, bottom 40% of the population earning less than 12% of the income. Go up. What about the 60th percentile? 60th percentile is all together. So the bottom 6 out of 10 income earners are now earning less than 25% of total incomes. Okay, so the poorest, the middle class, are clearly worse off today, earning less of the income than they were 40 years ago. Perhaps it's that all of these gains have gone to the top. Well, let's take a look. What is the 90th percentile doing? Well, those in the 90th percentile of income are capturing altogether, oh, that's about 65% of income. So what we see all together is that the 90th percentile is earning less than they used to. Let's use the right tool here. They're earning less than they used to. They're earning less than they used to. They're earning less than they used to. So that is, if everywhere along here is earning less than they used to, where has all this income gone? Well, that is all of the income. And I shouldn't say all of the income, but the largest share of the economic growth, of the income growth in our last 40 years has gone to that top 10% of incomes. Partially, right? If we take a look at our model, there's two ways to get more income. You can either have more bargaining power and use that stronger negotiating power to push the income more in your favor, that is closer to the other one's minimum willingness to accept. Or B, you can change the rules of the game, have governments put in rules of the game that would ultimately affect in your favor. And what we see here in Canada is essentially that happening. And altogether, one of the big results is income being increasingly concentrated in the top 10% of income earners across the country. But of course, the question is this just a Canadian phenomenon? Let's go take a look. How does it compare to, say, a country like the US, which is historically been held up as a hallmark of positive social class mobility. So let's go take a look at the US. So similar kind of exercise, we see the USA in 2020, we see the USA in 1980. Again, ignore these Gini coefficients for the time being. We'll talk about them a little bit later. What do we take away from this? How can we interpret this diagram? Well, again, let's take a look at the 40th, the 60th, and the 90th percentiles. Starting off with the 1980s. Well, in the 1980s, the 40th percentile, so the bottom 4 out of 10 people, they earned, again, about 12.5% of the nation's income. So quite similar to our Canadian context. The bottom 60% earned about just over 25% of the nation's income. So, hey, in this case here in the 1980s, the US was doing better than Canada. The bottom 60% was accounting for more of the income than the bottom 60% in Canada, much stronger middle class altogether. Get to the richest, that top decile, so 90% of income earners are earning, and we find in the US, they're earning about 70% of income. So that is in the US in the 1980s, only about the 30% of income was going to that top 10%, right? And again, I'm assuming, I'm just taking a look at this, I'm guessing this is about 70%. I could be slightly wrong. I'm just eyeballing it, saying, okay, as a result, that top 10% is earning about the 30 remaining percent altogether. Well, let's fast forward to today, or at least the most recent year we have data on. And what we find is that the bottom 40%, so the bottom 4 out of 10 people, they are now earning significantly less, right? So where was that 12% line? That 12% line was right around there. So they are earning much lower. That's probably more like 8% of the income. So 4 out of 10 Americans are only accounting for 8% of the national income. We go up to the 60% of people. So 60% of people are now earning less than 25%. Used to be greater than 25%. Now we're below the 25% and a bit more so. So definitely lost here as well. Well, again, same question. What about up at the 90th percentile, that cutoff between being in the top 10%? And we see they've actually been hit quite hard, going from nearly 70% of income down to 60, well, I'd say even maybe that's like 55, 52. That is what we've witnessed in the US in particular, is that this top income decile has witnessed massive gains in income, truthfully, at the expense of every other income decile, drastically reducing. And similar to what we've seen in Canada, in fact, even more exaggerated than what we've seen in Canada, is we've seen an erosion of income at all income levels except for at the highest income levels, which have seen marked gains. Now, again, going back to our model, there's two ways that this happens. You either obtain more economic power to negotiate, to push those wages down so that you can get more on your favor, or B, you change the rules of the game to benefit you. And in the US, we see this happening as well, such that income is increasingly being concentrated up with the highest income earners, those with the most power to influence. Is it the same everywhere? Well, let's take a look at a European country. Let's take a look at what's happening in another third and final case. And then we'll talk about the Gini coefficient. Okay, in this scenario, we're taking a look at a different set of countries. Well, sorry, it's still one country, but over two different time periods. In this case, we're evaluating France. And we're taking a look at France in the 1980s as well as France in 2020 and evaluating the income, or rather the effect on income distributions over this 40-year time period. Again, let's use the same income thresholds as we used for Canada and the US, which was going to be the 40th, the 60th, and the 90th. Okay, so starting off with the 40th. So the bottom 4 out of 10 French citizens, French residents, they are earning just over 12.5% of the income. So, okay, not so bad. Where are they in 2020? That is 40 years later. They are earning, oh, look at that. That looks like they are still earning about the same proportion of income, maybe even slightly higher if I'm interpreting that. That is, I'm not interpreting, but evaluating those lines correctly. I would almost say this has been a slight increase in share of income for the bottom 40%. That is, they're doing better today than they were 40 years ago. That's a good thing. This is positive social mobility. What about the 60th percentile? Well, in France, we see that the bottom 60% of income earners were earning, I'd say that's close to 30% of income altogether. Fast forward to 2020, and these bottom 60% are now earning, I would still say that's about the same. So we haven't seen this erosion, or at least to the same degree in France as we have in income, as we have in Canada and the US. What about the top 90th percentile, though? Well, take a look. Back in 1980s, the top 90th percentile was getting just under 75%. That line there would be about 67.5. So close to 70% of income. Let's just throw that in there. 0.7% of income. 70% was being earned by 90% of the top population, meaning your richest 10% were only earning 30% of the income. Where are we today? We are arguably pretty much the same as we were. Again, about 0.7% altogether. Again, I'm just eyeballing these, meaning again, very similarly, your top 10% are still only accounting for about 30% of your population, or 30% of your income. Result of this altogether is we haven't seen nearly as much movement in income redistribution. In fact, where we have seen it the most in France has been amongst the bottom, amongst the poorest people, such that they're actually gaining a larger share of the income. That is positive social mobility, that is more engagement in the economy. Typically, we would view this as a good thing. We're becoming increasingly equal altogether. More and more people are actually having the opportunity to engage and participate in the modern economy in France versus what we're witnessing in Canada and the US, which is more and more people being pushed to the bottoms, being pushed to the margins of the economy. So those are our Lorenz curves. That is the basic idea as to how we can read and interpret them. Let's go talk about these Gini coefficients. And they've been popping up on all of them. What exactly do they mean? So let's go jump over and have a look at that. Okay, here we are back with our fictional Lorenz curve that I had just drawn. What we can do to evaluate this is to be able to find the Gini coefficient. What the Gini coefficient allows us to do is just to quickly compare between countries or even within the same country across time, as we saw in those diagrams, the level of inequality that is taking place. And it's just a way to aggregate all of the information into this graph into just a single number. And of course, that's very imperfect by doing so, but it allows us to give at least some ability for quick comparison. And the way that this can be done is by separating this into area A and area B. So area A is everything between that 45-degree line and the Lorenz curve itself. And then area B is everything between the Lorenz curve and the axes and this dotted line of 100% there. Altogether, we get a Gini coefficient that is A divided by A plus B. When we get a Gini coefficient of 1, so let's look at our extremes. A Gini coefficient of 1 means that A accounts for this entire area. That would be an extreme case. Let's use red to denote this. Where your Lorenz curve would go like this along the axes, and then the richest one person earns 100% of the income. If we had a situation like that, well, then you would have a Gini coefficient of 1 because area A would account for everything and area B would just be 0 in that case there. Okay, so that's the one extreme. The other extreme is if we have a Gini coefficient of 0. And a Gini coefficient, so Gini coefficient of 1 is perfect inequality. 0 would be perfect equality. And if we use green to denote this, this would be a Lorenz curve that just falls right on that 45-degree line. If our Lorenz curve just fell right on the 45-degree line, well, in that case, there's no area A. It's just area B. So 0 over B is 0. We get a Gini coefficient of 0, which means perfect equality. So altogether, the closer your Gini coefficient is to 0, the more equal your society. The closer your Gini coefficient is to 1, the more unequal your society. So keeping that in mind, let's go and jump back and take a look at these Gini coefficients for the different Lorenz curves we were looking at. What we see is that in France, we had a Gini coefficient of 0.467 in 1980. So all else equal, closer to 0, fairly equal society. And moving to 2020, so 40 years later, has gotten even closer to 0, drastically, but slightly, showing that France has been moving towards greater equality over that 40-year period. Alternatively, if we take a look at the US has moved from a Gini coefficient of 0.507, so almost right in that point of being between more equal or more unequal, but has moved quite far from 0.5 to 0.62. So in this case here has been moving closer to one. Moving closer to one, the US has become drastically more unequal over this 40-year time period. And what about Canada finally? What we see in Canada is although Canada started off as less equal than the US and has been becoming more unequal itself, we definitely have not been witnessing as drastic of a slide as what we've witnessed in the US. Yes, our society is becoming increasingly unequal. However, we have been better at holding on to equality than the US has, although we still are seeing the same structural things happening. And as a result, we are moving increasingly towards inequality rather than, as we saw with the French case, a movement towards equality. So Lorenz curves are one way that we can look at this distribution of income and help us to determine the corresponding levels of equality or inequality and what is happening over time within those countries. Based off of that, if we don't like what we see, we can, of course, begin to change it. And the way we go about changing it is through our institutions, by changing the rules of the game, by changing the ability that different parties have to influence the outcome in one favor or another. That is, if we go jump back and have a look, by changing the rules of the game or that relative power to negotiate and push down incomes or up incomes one way or another, ultimately will have massive impacts on that income distribution. Things like union participation rates and your ability to actually effectively negotiate your wage in that collective bargaining, the erosion of that arguably has been one of the big key contributing factors to the erosion of equality in Canada, in the US over these last 40 years. Not to mention all the different changes in the rules of the game that typically have pushed the negotiating power, has pushed more of the power into the hands of the owner of the resource rather than the potential laborer who is the one making the product. Now, of course, where do we want to end up? That is a normative statement based off of society's values about equality and inequality. There's lots of reasons why we don't want a very unequal society. Unequal societies tend to have higher cases of social discohesion, less levels of trust. All of these are very problematic for a functioning economy, not to mention a functioning, healthy society. So, for many reasons, we would be and should be concerned about increasing inequality. That does us for this video. I ended up going off on a bit of a tangent and detour from what I wanted to cover, but hopefully you found that interesting. Big part here is being able to interpret these curves and that distribution of income and that pushing towards either the indifference curve or the production possibility frontier, and how those different rules change your ability to do it or where we end up. The other big takeaway was the Lorenz curve, being able to look at and interpret the Lorenz curve, as well as interpret the Gini coefficient and interpret the differences between. Of course, if you have any questions on anything we covered in this video, please feel free to reach out, leave a comment below, or send me an email. Thanks, until next time.